President, Brett Kavanaugh's record as judge and lawyer is clear, hostile to health care for millions, opposed to the CFPB, corporate accountability, thinks President Trump is above the law, on and on and on. Nancy Pelosi at 10:11, Bernie Sanders at 10:18. If Brett Kavanaugh is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it will have profoundly negative effect on workers' rights, women's rights, and voting rights for the decades to come. All I can say, within an hour and 18 minutes of your nomination, you became the biggest threat to democracy in the eyes of some of the most partisan people in the country who would hold Kagan and Sotomayor up qualified and would challenge any Republican dare vote against them. You live in unusual times, as I do. You should get more than 90 votes, but you won't. And I am sorry it has gotten to where it has. It's got nothing to do about you. If you don't mind, and you don't have to, what did you tell your children yesterday about the hearing?
They did as they, I'll tell them what they told me. I think they gave me a big hug and said, "Good job, Daddy." And Margaret, before she went to bed, made a special trip down and said, "Give me a special hug."
I just wish if we could have a hearing where the nominees' kids could show up. Is that asking too much? So what kind of country have we become? None of this happened just a couple of years ago. It's getting worse and worse and worse, and all of us have an obligation to try to correct it where we can. Roe v. Wade. Are you familiar with the case?
I am, Senator.
Can you, in 30 seconds, give me the general holding of Roe v. Wade?
As elaborated upon in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, a woman has a constitutional right, as interpreted by the Supreme Court on the Constitution, to obtain an abortion up to the point of viability, subject to reasonable regulations by the state, so long as those reasonable regulations do not constitute an undue burden on the woman's right.
Okay, as to how the system works, can you sit down with you and 4 other judges and overrule Roe v. Wade just because you want to?
Senator, Roe v. Wade's an important precedent of the Supreme Court, been reaffirmed. But
don't you have to have a case as a, I mean, you just can't, yeah. Hey, what are you doing for lunch? Let's overrule Roe v. Wade. It doesn't work that way, right?
I see what you're asking, Senator. Right. There's the way cases come up to us in that context or in other contexts would be a laws passed.
Can I give you an example? Because I can do this quicker.
Yes.
So some state somewhere or some town somewhere passes a law that runs into the face of Roe. Somebody will object. They'll go to lower courts, and eventually it might come up to the Supreme Court challenging the foundations of Roe v. Wade. It would take some legislative enactment for that to happen. Is that correct?
That's correct.
If there was such an action by a state or a local government challenging Roe, and it came before the Supreme Court, would you listen to both sides?
I listen to both sides in every case, Senator. I have for 12 years, yes.
When it comes to overruling a longstanding precedent of the court, is there a formula that you use? Analysis.
First of all, you start with the notion of precedent. And as I've said to Senator Feinstein, in this context, this is a precedent that's been reaffirmed many times over 45 years, including in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where they specifically considered whether to overrule and reaffirmed and applied all the stare decisis factors. So that importantly became precedent on precedent in this context. But you look at, there are factors you look at whenever you're considering any precedent.
So there's a process in place that the court has followed for a very long time. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator.
Citizens United.
Yes.
If somebody said Citizens United has been harmful to the country and made a record that the effects of Citizens United has empowered about 20 or 30 people in the country to run all the elections, and some state or locality somewhere passed a a ban on soft money and it got to the court, would you at least listen to the argument that Citizens United needs to be revisited?
Of course, I listen to all arguments. You have an open mind. You get the briefs and arguments, and some arguments are better than others. Precedent's critically important. It's a foundation of our system, but you listen to all arguments.
Okay. Where were you on September 11th, 2001?
I was initially I was in my then office in the EOB, and then after the first, as I recall, after the first building was hit, I was in the council's office on the second floor of the West Wing for the next few minutes. Then we were all told to go down to the bottom of the West Wing, and then we were all evacuated. And I think the thought was Flight 93 might have been heading for the White House. It might have been heading here, and Secret Service. We were being hustled out, and then kind of panicked, started screaming at us, sprint, run, and we sprinted out. My wife was a few steps ahead of me. She was President Bush's personal aide at the time, and we sprinted out. She was wearing a black and white check shirt, I remember, and we sprinted out the front gate, kind of into Lafayette Park, and no iPhones or anything like that. BlackBerries at that point in time, we didn't have that, and our cell phones didn't work, so we were all just kind of out there. And then I remember somehow ending up seeing on TV down more on Connecticut Avenue, there were TVs out at the Mayflower Hotel. I remember I was with Sarah Taylor, who worked at the White House, and we were watching as standing with her when the buildings fell.
So when somebody says post 9/11 that we've been at war and it's called the war on terrorism, do you generally agree with that concept?
I do, Senator, because Congress passed the authorization for use of military force, which is still in effect, and that was passed, of course, on September 14th, 2001, 3 days later.
Let's talk about the law in war. Is there a body of law called the law of armed conflict?
There is such a body, Senator.
Is there a body of law that's called basic criminal law?
Yes, Senator.
Are there differences between those two bodies of law?
Yes, Senator.
From an American citizen's point of view, do your constitutional rights follow you? If you're in Paris, does the Fourth Amendment protect you as an American from your own government?
From your own government, yes.
Okay. So if you're in Afghanistan, do your constitutional rights protect you against your own government?
If you're an American in Afghanistan, you have constitutional rights as against the U.S. government.
Is there a long-standing...
That's long-settled law.
Isn't there also a long-settled law that it goes back to the Eisentrager case? I can't remember the name of it.
Yeah, Johnson versus Eisentrager.
Right. That American citizens who collaborate with the enemy have considered enemy combatants.
They can be. They can be. They're sometimes criminally prosecuted, sometimes treated in the military.
Well, let's talk about can be. I think
under Supreme Court precedent.
Right. There's a Supreme Court decision that said that American citizens who collaborated with Nazi saboteurs were tried by the military. Is that correct?
That is correct.
I think a couple of them were executed.
Yeah.
So if anybody doubts, there's a long-standing history in this country that your constitutional rights follow you wherever you go, but you don't have a constitutional right to turn on your own government, collaborate with the enemy of the nation. You'll be treated differently. What's the name of the case, if you can recall, that reaffirmed the concept that you could hold one of our own as an enemy combatant if they were engaged in terrorist activities in Afghanistan? Are you familiar with that case?
Yeah, Hamdi.
Okay. So the bottom line is, on every American citizen, no, you have constitutional rights, but you do not have a constitutional right to collaborate with the enemy. There's a body of law well developed long before 9/11 that understood the difference between basic criminal law and the law of armed conflict. Do you understand those differences?
I do understand that there are different bodies of law, of course, Senator.
Okay. If you're confirmed, and I believe you will be, What is your hope when all of this is said and done and your time is up? How would you like to be remembered?
A good dad, good judge,
Good husband.
I think he's getting there.
good husband,
Thanks, Diane. You helped him a lot. Going to be better for you tonight.
good. I owe you. Good son, I'll quickly add. Good friend. I think about the pillars of my life are being a judge, of course, being a teacher. I've done that, and either way this ends up, I'm going to continue teaching. Coaching, as I mentioned, huge part of my life. Try to continue that. Senator Kennedy advised me when we met, make sure you keep coaching, even if you get. I'm going to follow that. Volunteering and being a dad and a son and a husband and being a friend. I talked about my friends yesterday. I didn't really expect. I got a little choked up talking about my friends. But,
That was well said. You got to tighten it up because I just ran out of time.
okay. Thank you, Senator. I can go on, as you know, but I'll stop there.
Thank you.
We're about ready to break for lunch and a vote that we have, and it'll be 30 minutes. But before I do that, I have letters that Senator Feinstein asked me to put in the record from 70 letters from people in opposition to your nomination.